Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai. Welcome everyone to this webinar about the consultation on National Direction for Plantation and Exotic Carbon Afforestation. My name is Tracy Black and I'm a member of the project team for this consultation working at the Ministry for Primary Industries. We have two presenters today and I'll get them to introduce themselves in a minute. We also have other project team members in the background who may answer some of your questions later on. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is an information session to give you the opportunity to learn more about the proposals in the consultation document and for you to ask any questions you may have. We really want your submissions on the proposals, and this webinar is aimed to give you information to help you do that. You've most likely joined a Zoom meeting before. Our format today is a Zoom webinar, which is slightly different. You'll notice that you don't have any option to turn on your camera or microphone. So for any questions that you would like to ask, please send it to us using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer all your questions in the time we have available, and we're recording today's webinar and we'll post it to our consultation webpage soon. Your privacy will be protected, you won't be on camera and your names won't be seen. We set aside 2 hours for this webinar, but we know that is quite a long time. So we'll aim to finish by 2:30 unless you would like to extend the time. And now I'll ask our presenters to introduce themselves. First Shannon and then Alex.
Kia ora koutou and thank you, Tracy. Ko Shannon Tyler toko ingoa. I'm the manager of the Forestry and Bioeconomy Policy team here at the Ministry for Primary Industries. Over to you, Alex.
Kia ora koutou, ko Alex McDonald toko ingoa. I'm Alex. I'm a senior analyst in the Land and Water Systems team at the Ministry for the Environment, so Shannon's counterpart at MFE. Thanks very much. Looking forward to talking to you all later.
Thanks, Shannon and Alex. This is an outline of what we will cover today. As you probably know, since you're here, on the 6th of October, the government published a consultation document focused on proposals for changing environmental regulations for plantation and exotic carbon forestry. In this webinar, we'll take you through why the government is proposing change and explain what the National Environmental Standards for Plantation Forestry do. Shannon and Alex will run through the proposals in each part of the consultation document, and there will be opportunities after each section for questions. Through this consultation, we're looking for your feedback to help us understand the opportunities and challenges from an increase in exotic forests and to test the viability of the proposals we have to better manage forests. I'll hand over to Shannon to kick us off with an overview of why the government is proposing change.
Thank you. So, yes, why the government is looking at these proposals. Just to start with, that we recognise that forestry is a critical primary sector and hugely important to help us achieve our emissions reduction goals, as well as to contribute to the growth of our economy, our bioeconomy, and to supply sustainable products. And plantation forestry is a source of jobs and income across many rural communities. The government is working to grow the forestry and wood processing industry and to encourage more native forests as permanent forests. We are seeing a greater investment in forestry, and this is due to the significant increase in the carbon price and forestry's role in reducing emissions and in the demand for wood products. It's vital that the forestry sector grows in a way that is productive and sustainable. And in particular, the government is wanting to address concerns about the impacts to the environment and on rural communities from the potential conversion of productive farmland to exotic carbon forestry. These concerns include an overall loss of jobs and population in rural communities, which can affect the social infrastructure and facilities. Forestry also needs to be done in an environmentally sound way, and currently there are no national environmental standards for exotic carbon forests. The government wants to ensure the right forest is planted in the right place for the right reasons and managed in the right way. Please go to the next slide. So the proposals that we're going to be talking about today are primarily about changes to the National Environmental Standards for Plantation Forestry, which I'll refer to as the NESPF. And the NESPF is a set of regulations or controls under the Resource Management Act. Councils are responsible for enforcement of the regulations. The NESPF manages the environmental effects of plantation forestry, forests which are deliberately planted with an intent to harvest, and it covers all plantation forests over 1 hectare. The NESPF regulatory controls are nationally consistent rules, technical standards, methods, and planning requirements, but they also allow more stringent local rules to be set by councils in their district and regional plans. And as mentioned before, the NESPF does not currently apply to permanent exotic carbon forests. Next slide, please. Thank you. So through these proposals, we're aiming to ensure that the environmental management of all exotic afforestation occurs, as well as to consult on whether greater local control over the location and forest types or species of forests is required, and what options we have to achieve that. We are also looking to improve wildfire risk management planning and to address key feedback from the Year 1 review of the regulations to make improvements to the NESPF that will update it and make it more effective for councils and foresters. And we've organised the consultation and the proposals into 4 parts. And I'll hand over now to Alex to explain the proposals in part A.
Kia ora koutou, and thanks again, Shannon. Before we move into the detail of the proposals in part A, I'd just like to spend a minute talking forest definitions. So in these proposals, we've used the term carbon forest. You might have heard also permanent exotic forest, transitional forests. There's a range of different terms that people are using that. What we're intending is that carbon forest has a meaning similar to a plantation forest as defined in the NESPF, but will basically refer to forests that are not harvested, so that there's a flip, a plantation forest is harvested and a carbon forest is not harvested below a certain level of canopy cover. That also kind of covers permanent forests. With transitional forests, that's a particular type of exotic forest that we're hearing a lot about at the moment, where people will initially plant predominantly exotic species, faster growing ones such as Pinus radiata, and then transition that forest through to predominantly indigenous species over time, while maintaining a minimum level of canopy cover. We intend that transitional forests will be caught by the proposed carbon forest definition, but there's a bit of work there to do to think about the different forest models and what that means. And I'll touch on a little bit that in a little bit later. And if we move to the next slide, I'll get started on why we're doing this. So as Shannon mentioned, the NESPF was developed to create a nationally consistent regulatory regime for plantation forests. At the time, exotic carbon forests of the type we're seeing more of now weren't a huge consideration and aren't within its scope. What this means is that we've got a regulatory gap for these carbon forests now. They're not caught within the NESPF. They're often not captured by council rules. We know a few councils have rules that relate to them, Marlborough, for example. But even in those cases, there's still a potential mismatch where a forest might start out as a plantation forest and then not get harvested and become more permanent later in its life, or what happens if someone changes their mind. So we're really trying to manage that gap, be really clear that, these things do have environmental effects and manage those effects. We've also got a lot of uncertainty of what will happen in future decades. So if you think about a permanent exotic forest or a transitional forest, those are forests with lifespans of potentially hundreds of years. And over time, they might have issues that we don't currently see or see in a different way with plantation forestry, for example, differential impacts on steep land. It's also really hard for us to predict how much exotic carbon forests we'll see in the future, and it's heavily dependent on ETS settings. And we know that at the moment, those are still being looked at by the government, although the permanent exotic forest category is opening on the 1st of January next year. But I would just say as a stat, last year's Afforestation and Deforestation survey, which is undertaken by MPI, reported 63,000-ish hectares is intended to be afforested within 2022, and about 10,000 of that would be permanent. So that gives an idea of what we know or what we understand to be happening around now. Like I mentioned very briefly before, when this consultation was announced, ministers also announced that there would be ongoing work on the ETS permanent forestry category, and that's looking at those transitional forests over time. But like I mentioned just before, that category will open on the 1st of January next year. And so that means that we're expecting to be managing these permanent exotic carbon forests for a little while. And we really need to have a consistent regime that manages the environmental effects of all forests, basically. And if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk over our proposals just in a little bit more detail. Now, we have two proposals that are slightly separate, but very closely interrelated, as you'll hear in a moment. Proposal 1 is would amend the NES to add a definition covering the exotic carbon forests I've been mentioning, and basically subject those exotic carbon forests to the same standards that plantation forests already have to comply with. So for those of you that are more familiar with the NES, and I know some of you in the room will be, that would mean that an exotic carbon forest would have the same requirements for planting away from, rivers with setbacks or away from significant natural areas. However, we know that because of these slightly different forest models, we do need to have a think a little bit about if there are any specific things we need to do differently for exotic carbon forests. So for instance, like I mentioned before, over the long term, we might see different effects in terms of slope stability and erosion because they're not harvested. Or we might need to think about and manage the effects associated with that transitional forest model. That's all. We've got a fair amount of time to deal with that, as I'm sure you'll understand. If they're being planted this year, it's a little bit of time, but we need to start thinking about that now. We are specifically proposing to enable councils to consider wind throw on red zone land, given that exotic carbon forests will be subject to the same requirement as plantations, and that would require consent on that land. Proposal 2 is the supporting part, I suppose. And this is something that we recognize that we're going to need to really carefully consider any feedback we receive during this consultation. So this proposal would require forest management plans to have a management plan for the forest, and that management plan would be an RMA management plan. So again, for those of you that are more familiar with the NES, it'd be about similar in a sense to the harvest management plan, demonstrating how the exotic carbon forest would meet those environmental requirements over a really long period of time. Now, we're really aware that there's been a lot of feedback on management plans and a lot of discussion about the role they might play, for instance, in assisting people with the transition to native forests over time, or assisting in meeting broader outcomes, for instance, around biodiversity or transitioning. Now, that's something that is something we need to think about really carefully, because a management plan has to tie back to a specific environmental effect if it's an RMA management plan. And so within this consultation, we have this here as a proposal, but we really need all of your feedback as to how this management plan requirement would work within the context of the NES. We'd need to do a lot of work to make sure that it lined up really clearly and neatly with other statutory regimes, and that there was minimal duplication and clear boundaries with other regimes, and so that they were effective. I think that's basically all I want to say on those. Sorry, just scrolling through my notes. Yeah, and also how it would relate to the future permanent forest category. And on the next slide, just talk briefly about the impacts that we're expecting. So for those of you that have exotic carbon forests, you'll have to comply with the new standards. There's no dodging that one. In this case, it would be very similar, like I mentioned, to plantation forests. So if you have planted an exotic carbon forest but complied with the NESPF already anyway, then that would be a relatively easy situation. But of course, if you've done something different or there's been changes, that might have impacts on your particular forest. It will vary depending on what you're doing and where, of course, as well. And that's an area that it's important for us to receive feedback on so that we can understand what the impacts are for you and for the industry as a whole. For the plantation forestry sector, I think it's fair to say that we don't expect to see a huge amount of impact because you're already caught by the NES. And so we are expanding these standards so that exotic carbon forests have to comply with the same rules that you already do. For councils, obviously, this would mean a change, and it would be an additional activity that you would have national direction for. In this case, we know we need to provide some implementation support, but we're also hoping that there's some efficiencies for you in the sense that exotic carbon forests and plantation forests would be managed in a reasonably similar way. And we're keen to hear from you about how that would work. For rural communities and the wider public, it's like I mentioned, there's not a direct impact, but there's a long-term improvement for exotic carbon forests being managed to the same standard that plantation forests already do. Because if you think back to what I said before, we know in some areas that exotic carbon forests are not particularly regulated. Well, this would bring them in and put that basically environmental baseline in place for them. Now, if we go to the next slide, we've got a time for anyone to ask a couple questions. I have seen a couple that have come up during this, but I'll pass to Tracy to see what the overall point is.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks very much for running through those proposals and impacts. We do have a couple of questions so far. I might ask Bridget, who's checking Q&As in the background, to answer the first question, and maybe Alex, you may have follow on after Bridget's answered this one. The question is about definitions. So the question is an exotic carbon forest or a permanent exotic forest that is intended to be harvested while maintaining a minimum 30% canopy, subject to the regulations that are currently in the NESPF. Bridget, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, thanks. And that's a really good question. I'll just preface this for people who may not know this, and I think that the person asking the question probably does, but the NESPF covers forests for harvest, and it includes a provision in there to manage forests that are would stay as, I guess, permanent cover forests up to 75% canopy cover. So that was anticipated in the development of the NESPF, and I think it's regulation 63 that covers that. I think this question that's being asked is about the ETS, which allows for a forest to be regarded as maintaining canopy cover whilst getting down to 30%, which of course looks quite a lot like clearfell harvest, depending on how it's done. So I think this is one of those things that falls into the grey area, in that we don't cover exotic carbon forests. However, we do cover the activity of harvest. So, I mean, Alex, do you want to comment on whether that would fall in it? It's that question of when something which has been planted for another purpose falls within the remit of the NESPF.
Yeah, and I think this is an area where, for those of you that have good examples of different permanent or exotic carbon forest management regimes with harvest, it'd be helpful if you can pass those through so we can understand. The intent is that a plantation forest is captured within the regular plantation forestry harvesting rules, and that for carbon forests, if there is rules that enable some harvesting to be done alongside the similar rules in the NES, the ones that Bridget was mentioning, but whether that will actually work for those forest models, or whether people even know yet, given that these haven't grown up yet, is an area that we'd actually be interested in feedback on. But yeah, I think hopefully that helps answer the question. What I'd also say here is that there's a bit of a chance to have a deep dive with Bridget tomorrow morning on the Part A stuff. And I'm just going to plug that if you haven't signed up there, and we can also answer that. Sorry, just reading.
And I guess just to follow up on that, thank you, Alex. The intention of the NESPF, there's a number of things, but it was very much predicated on managing the environmental effects of harvest, most of which is clearfell in this country. So, you know, for something to get down to 30% canopy cover, there's a very good case that harvest needs to be managed. That is not negligible. And I'm unaware of how much of that happens, but clearly it is anticipated in the ETS. And so, you know, obviously there's a good case for it. Thanks. Good question.
Thank you both. I'll go to the next question, ask Alex to tackle this one. So this is about our option that we've put forward in the discussion document about amending the existing NESPF rather than developing a separate national environmental standard that relates to exotic carbon forestry. The questioners noted that we identified that would be an option in our regulatory impact statement, but we didn't include that in the consultation document. So Alex, would you be able to answer that question?
Yeah, of course. And so I think here the key thing is that the regulatory impact statement, for those of you that are familiar, it needs to explore all the different avenues for addressing the policy problem which we've identified, which is the poor management or gap in mismanagement for exotic carbon forestry. Now, we did some work as to whether or not it would be better in a separate NES or within the NES plantation forestry. And I think we came to the conclusion with this proposal that it would be easier and more workable for, in most situations, to have exotic carbon forests within the NES. And that's so that for the reasons that I mentioned before, you know, if you change forest type, or you're transitioning over time, or if you're a council and you're monitoring two different types of forests, if they're separate NESs, it adds another degree of complexity to what's a system that's already quite hard. So if you move from being a permanent forest to a plantation forest, not only would you change management, you'd also change NES with any potential issues or challenges that might cause. And you'd also have to look at, you know, what it would mean in terms of any council rules, if there are one, and we're discussing those in a minute. Now, that's not to say that it's perfect the way it is. And so if there's a strong reason why we should relook at having a separate NES, then I'd be interested to hear that.
Thanks, Alex. So I'll go on to the next question now, which is about the scope of the proposals. So the question is, why do these proposals that we're talking about here in Part A only relate to exotic carbon forests? The questioner asks, is it assumed that native forests or Indigenous forests will not require management? And you know, why not just have a set of rules and requirements that applies to any type of forest? Alex, is that something that you could tackle?
Yeah, and I think this is hopefully a quick one. The short answer is that Indigenous forests were out of scope because they felt to be a sufficiently different activity on the face of it, and when you are out there looking at it, particularly when in those first few years immediately after planting, that it would be really challenging for us to have it in at this stage. And also beyond that is there's a whole bunch of additional considerations that we'd need to think really carefully about would it have Indigenous forestry within scope of the EDS, you know, accounting for factors such as their much longer growth timeframes, different management requirements, and potentially different effects. And that was all just, to be honest, a real challenge for us, and we tried to keep it manageable for us and for you. I'll pass to Bridget as well, who was more involved in this than me.
Yeah, I think a couple of things to note for people who aren't aware of it. The NESPF does manage any Indigenous forest planted for harvest. So New Zealand has a small amount of Indigenous forest that will be is harvested in as plantation, not a lot, maybe more in future. And so that is covered by the NESPF. I think one of the things that people will be thinking about is about the various forest effects like fire and pests and disease control and things like that that are very similar for Indigenous forests, and those are real considerations. And I think if New Zealand, obviously the DOC estate has to manage those things, the same would be true of people who want to plant Indigenous forests. As you'll see, we've written up and we talk about quite a lot. Other legislation often covers these things, and so the question does start to become, what are the things that the RMA covers? But obviously, in relation to Part B, that's another question that will come up. So we've talked about it quite a lot. I don't think any final decisions have been made about what will happen in future, but as Alex says, we're sort of taking off these things in bites. I think this one.
Thank you, Bridget. So Alex, another question for you, and Bridget might want to tag team on this one too. This is about windthrow. So the question is, how might the regulation work for windthrow in practice, noting adverse events cover in the ETS? Owners will want to salvage wind-thrown trees, and salvage time is critical. Is that something that you can answer, Alex?
I think I'll let Bridget go first on this one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks
a lot, and thanks very much, anonymous person, for that question. This is, there is windthrow within forests, which is, a known effect in some plantation forests. I think what we're looking at here is about this question of stability of forests. I think most forests are very stable. This has been brought up by some people who are concerned about aged forests perhaps getting too heavy for the skeletal soils, or and being much larger, heavier trees than a typical forest grown to about 25, 28 years. And is this something that needs to be considered? I guess the question is, does it need to be considered, is one of the things that we are asking, and we're interested to hear what people have to say about that. In looking at the matters of discretion that we already have in the NESPF, arguably this is something that were a council to provide a resource consent in a red zone, they would already be able to consider this. I don't know whether anybody has, but it's possible. But yes, this is the question of, do we need to cover that, because it's something that becomes more of a risk for permanent forests if they are planted on red zone land.
Thanks.
I'm just checking the question to see if I
Thanks,
and I will just point out, yes, of course, owners would want to salvage wind-thrown trees because it is time critical, because obviously, after a certain point, the bugs get in and they lose all value. So, it's a question of how possible that is as well, I guess, and whether an assessment has to be made over whether, a forest is in an area that's possible, or whether they can migrate into, dangerous situations. Yep.
Thanks. That's great. I will move on to the next question now, which is about the interaction between the NESPF and the ETS. But I think the question is maybe can be answered by thinking about the scope of the NESPF. The question is, what would happen if there are changes in the ETS, and would the forest management plan that's proposed under the NESPF in this part of the proposals require provisions for a change to a non-permanent forest, so to a forest for harvest, for example? Is that something
I can
that you can, Bridget? Thank you.
I mean, I guess, it's a reasonable question, and I don't think we've talked that scenario through exactly in terms of what that would mean from a regulatory perspective. I guess in the event that someone was no longer getting income from a permanent forest, I would imagine they would seek to harvest it to recover value from that, because plantation forestry is a good business. But I don't think we have anticipated that. Sorry, Alex, I lost your comment there, so I want to follow that up.
I was just going to add as well that this is an area where, if there are significant changes to the ETS in the future, and I'm not saying that there will be or won't be, but we work really quite closely with them to try and make sure that this sort of stuff works, because we're well aware that the ETS is currently the major driver for this type of forestry, and if those settings change, then we'd need to relook at that. Now, can't say for sure in any particular future case, but that's where we're at the moment.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks. And just one more question before we move on to the next part. So this question is about how will existing use rights apply? And the question is referring to Section 10 of the RMA. If Proposal 1 was to apply, so e.g. if exotic carbon forests have been established over the last few years, how would existing use rights apply? How would the NES affect those forests if it was changed in the way that we're proposing? Alex, can you tackle that one?
Yeah, this is a me one for my sins. So what I'd say is, for those of you that are out there, existing use rights are never quite as straightforward as they look to be on the cover. So it would depend on the final split of rules between regional matters and district matters. So many of the rules in the NESPF relate to regional matters or both, and regional matters have more limited existing use rights under the Act. If we introduce a rule that relates to a regional matter, then that'll need to be complied with on an ongoing basis from the point where it becomes appropriate. However, of course, there will be situations where people do have existing use rights that are limited, that exist in a limited in some ways or others. So we obviously can't overrule an existing use right with an NES. That's not possible. But so if you've planted your forest and you're covered by that existing use right, you'd then be able to continue your activity. But it'd take a lot of work to manage every individual situation on that front. The other thing, of course, is I draw attention to there is obviously the ability for people to apply for various certificates of existing use and the like, or certificates of compliance when they start an activity, to make sure that they have clarity as to what their existing use rights would be in the event of a change, or what their situation is going forward.
Thanks, Alex. Well, thank you very much for those questions. So that's the end of our presentation on part A, and we will move now into talking about part B, and Alex is going to take us through those proposals as well. Thanks, Alex.
Cool. And before I move on to part B, I just say that if you want to talk part A even more, like we said before, there is a workshop tomorrow that will be ably available to grill Bridget at. Part B, so controlling the location of plantation and exotic forest. Now, if we move on to the next slide, you'll see basically there's been increased exotic afforestation, and this has raised concerns from communities, primary sector interest councils, and NGOs about the impact of those forests on their communities. And we need to ensure that the right forest is planted in the right place for the right purpose, like Shannon said earlier. We also need to find the right balance, because exotic afforestation is critical to meeting our climate change goals. The increase in forestry that we've seen relatively recently is a change from where things have been for the last 15 years. And we estimate that basically around 100,000 hectares of forests have been planted over the last 3 years, with some of that being permanent exotic carbon forests. Now, this afforestation has raised concerns about the social and economic effects on the communities, but those effects will depend on a huge range of factors. For example, the location of the forest, whether it's deep in hill country or on highly productive land, its size, the broader landscape context, is it in an area that's got a lot of forestry already, or is it in an area that has been predominantly in pastoral uses. And in some cases, that'll mean changes to the community or, changes to the broader economic makeup. We've heard from some communities that they're concerned that if there's too many farms that become forests, that will affect the viability of the meatworks in the town or other rural processing thing. Of course, we also know that forestry brings opportunities, including plantation forestry with harvesting, afforestation, and the management of those forests. And that, again, the relative balance of that will depend a lot on the land in question, whether it's 6 or 7 highly erodible land, or whether it's on more productive 4s, 5s. Sorry, for those of you that aren't sure what those numbers refer to, it's land use capability. Now, the existing situation is that basically we don't manage these types of effects with the NESPF. We manage environmental effects of plantation forestry, things like wildings and setbacks that I mentioned before, but it's not clear how councils could manage these effects either. Councils can currently make rules to manage exotic carbon forestry because it's out of scope of the NES, but obviously we've just talked about bringing that into scope, which would also change the situation for councils. In terms of doing that, this is what Part B seeks to achieve. It's about giving the right tools to manage those issues around location and afforestation effects, and giving those in a way that works for councils and communities. If we go on to the next slide, we'll look at what the specific options are. So we have provided 2 approaches, and I just wanted to note that we've not identified a preferred approach in the consultation document here, because we're really open as to what might work or what we need to think about. It's about balancing the need for afforestation to meet our climate change goals. The key choice is whether we have the consent requirement in the NES or whether we give the control back to councils. So the first choice is we would give controls to councils, which would mean rules in your district or regional plan. This would clarify that councils can make rules to manage the effects of exotic afforestation, and we do that by enabling more stringent or lenient rules in the NES. Councils would then go out with a plan change or at a plan review time and have their own rules around what managing exotic afforestation would look like. There'd obviously be no obligation on councils to make those rules. The existing afforestation rules in the NES would remain as a backstop managing those environmental effects. We'd also need to provide support to communities to help them work through that rulemaking process. The second option, option 2, is a national direction for a consent requirement. So that would be amending the NES to introduce a framework that would require consents for afforestation. We haven't developed a detailed version of that, and you notice that we don't have that in the discussion document. And that's because there's a lot of variables that we need to think about really carefully. So would some forests be permitted, and up to what size? Do we need to think about some land classes more than others? Consent on would only be required on classes 1 to 5, or in all cases? And how do we manage that interaction with our most erosion prone land? In this case, we really need your feedback on those variables if we were to proceed with this option. So how would it work for councils? How would it work for applicants who are seeking to afforest? And how would it actually manage the ability of these communities to manage the effects of what they're most concerned about? And once again, I stress we don't have a preferred option here, so we're really interested as to what feedback you'd have as to how these might work. If we move on to the next slide, just talk a little bit about them more. So if we gave local control very strongly back to councils, they'd be able to determine a priority approach that meets their needs, and it would recognize the different situations around the country. It would also really run the risk of inconsistency and duplication, as different councils made different rules to manage much of the same issue. And that might be challenging for the sector to manage and be challenging for, more broadly, us meeting our climate change objectives. It'd also take time, because for those of you that work in this area, you'll know that a council plan change or plan review isn't a quick and easy thing to deliver. It might take several years or even longer, and that might be very challenging for some councils, particularly some of our smaller rural councils. Option 2, so developing a consenting framework, would mean a nationally consistent set of rules. We'd still have to work through all those design choices, but whatever those rules would be, they would exist nationally. Now, like I mentioned before, we'd need to think about what those choices would be, size, whether some forests are permitted, how we would distinguish between plantation and exotic carbon forests. But that's all things that we can work through with your help. This could be implemented more quickly, but it would still be a challenge for people to implement out on the ground once these new rules are out, because you have to think about a resource consent alongside the other planning instruments. And over the long term, councils would likely need to think about objectives and policies to help manage these consents anyway in their district plan. Now, the other challenge that this has is a consent by consent requirement is really difficult to manage cumulative effects. And so a lot of the issues that we've heard about from rural communities, around loss of the ability to support key primary sector, is a cumulative thing. It's not one forest that necessarily causes the problem. It is a lot of new forests happening quickly. And that's really challenging for us to manage through a consent framework. And so if we were to proceed with this option, we need to think really carefully about how we could do that. It doesn't necessarily work well with the direction of resource management reform, and we need to think carefully about how it would transition into the new system. And that's got, to some extent, harder for us to do looking forward. Now, like I mentioned before, there would be uncertainty for those in the sector that would be planting, because you'd suddenly have a requirement to get resource consents for individual forests as you went to plant them. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and there is some time for some questions on there. Now, sorry, that's been a brief overview because it is challenging to explain what's a really complex proposal, but later in the week, there is the workshop on this as well, so we can go into more detail there. And I see we've got a bunch of questions.
Thanks, Alex. The first question I would like to start with is something I think you can maybe clarify something. The question is, why are you taking the rights away from local communities to make choices through their council plans? So could you explain the difference between the two options?
So I don't think we're necessarily intending to do that. It's a combination of where the status quo is at the moment and the amendments in Part A. So currently, permanent exotic forests are unmanaged. Now, if we bring those into the NES rules and the RMA requirements around how a plan interacts with an NES would then apply to those exotic carbon forests. So we then would have to make a further change, and that change is option 1, to ensure that councils would continue to have that ability to manage exotic carbon forests in the location of this. So I think I hope I've made that clearer. I think that's something that we can work through as well in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you, Alex. The next question relates to the difference in activities, in activities carried out in plantation versus permanent forests. And I think Bridget might be able to help us with an answer on this one. So the question is suggesting that because the activities are different in the different forests, the environmental and social effects from those activities will be different. So how can one set of afforestation rules be developed for both? Would that or wouldn't that result in regulations that aren't fit for purpose for one or both? Bridget?
So I guess I would say that, and you know, we did discuss this at length, and thought about a separate NES for exotic forests. I think there are some different effects, and there are some different, certainly are some different drivers. From a set of rules perspective, I guess I would think that as long as you get the rules right, where they sit is less of an issue. I guess I'm interested to hear from people who are concerned about both activities being within one set of regulations, what the factors are that are an issue. So is this about, you know, having 2 books of rules and it's easier for everybody to understand that this is all the rules that apply to us and these are the rules that apply to other people? Or is it
I think Bridget has frozen.
Yes, I think we might have just lost Bridget, but I think what she was following up there with was an encouragement for people to submit on.
She's back.
Oh, you're back, Bridget. I was just paraphrasing to say, I think what you're asking is when people come to us with submissions to say whether and why they would find having rules applying to different activities set out in different regulations. Was that sort of where you were ending up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the really specific questions about what the effect will be. Certainly, we need to make sure that the rules are applicable to the appropriate activity, so that whatever the rules are, they cover the effects that have been identified. And if you think that won't work, please tell us why that won't work, and whether it's a practical thing or an interpretation or a legal thing. You know, we're very interested to hear.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a question here that I'm not sure if I'm following it correctly. Alex, if you could maybe look in the Q&A box. It's the question at the top that is talking about social and economic effects not being undertaken at the time of existing, maybe it's the existing rules. That means that the existing afforestation rules of district councils are still in force. All but one district council in a general rural zone require resource consents for afforestation. So then really existing rules are still in force. I'm not sure if there's a question.
I could speak to that briefly, but I might need to talk to the question asker offline just to make sure I've got the full of this. So the issue we have here is that when the NESPF came out, councils undertook plan alignment and some of them deleted their existing rules for afforestation. Now, how that interacts now when we know that we have a new type of forest that may or may not have been caught by those rules and is not within the scope of the NES is challenging to work through in the detail. Now, in general, for exotic carbon forests, because they're outside of scope at the NES, if the council has a rule around afforestation and that rule hasn't been deleted, that rule is still in force, or should be.
Thanks, Alex. And maybe, we'll be able to follow up later with the questioner. So the next question I was thinking Bridget might be able to answer, and Alex, you could follow up. Is it intended to expand the scope of NESPF Regulation 6C to allow councils greater stringency if the NESPF is amended in line with option 1?
Actually, Alex, can I chuck that one back at you?
Yeah.
Because, sorry.
So look, the specific policy decision or drafting is a matter that we take after the consultation, but as a general term, that's what we're seeking to do with option 1. So option 1 would be a combination of either modifying the stringency provisions or clarifying the scope provisions to make it clear that councils have the ability to manage the location of afforestation and any associated effects of that. So that is just the afforestation activity. Hope that clarifies.
Thanks, Alex. Another question for you about the interaction with the resource management reforms. Will council options, so I guess either of these options under Part B, be transferred to the Natural and Built Environments Act once that is enacted? And do we have an idea of what this may look like and how responsive they may be to local communities?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't feel like I'm going to have the most satisfactory answer for this question. At a high level, we're looking to move existing national direction, including the NESPF, into the new system. Now, we don't have the strongest idea as to what that will look like yet, because obviously the new NBA is not out yet, not in force, and we'll have work to do during that transitional period. We're trying to think about it at the moment to make sure that we have done the thinking so that when that transition comes, it is more straightforward, but there'll always be challenges, and thinking about how that works is something that we work through during the transition to the new system.
Thanks, Alex. The next question relates to option 1 in particular, I think. The question is referring to the original intent behind the NESPF, which was to bring consistency and efficiency to the management of the effects of plantation forestry. And so the question is, how would we manage the risk of perverse outcomes or unintended consequences of councils developing their own rules? And the question is suggesting that, well, those rules could include keeping plantation forestry out of their districts.
Yeah, so look, it's a valid concern, and we'd need to work through an implementation program for this. I think at a broader level, it's worth mentioning that that isn't a concern that's limited to one option or the other, which is why we don't have a preferred one, because we know that there's potential perverse consequences for the sector, and we're keen to have any option that's moved forward work in the way that's most appropriate, so that, like I mentioned during the presentation briefly, that we don't risk inhibiting afforestation and consequently our ability to meet climate change goals. It's a tough one. It's not easy. And
Bridget, did you follow up?
Yeah, I'll just follow up. I mean, I think that question, there's also, you know, that question of the ways in which forests are beneficial, and particularly in relation to freshwater, probably, and the way that regional councils are going to need to meet their freshwater obligations. So we're very alive to the fact that, you know, there are a number of things that need to be lined up, and you know, as Alex says, when the national planning framework is pulled together, this is the sort of question that will have to be addressed.
And I guess there's a question in here that, just for clarification, that would be good to comment on very briefly. I'm going to try and answer it myself and hope I get it right. For clarification, are the proposed options, so the ones we're talking about here under Part B, specific to exotic carbon forests, or do they also include plantation forests? And what we're looking for is feedback on what they should include, but they aren't limited to just to exotic carbon forests at this stage. The eventual outcome of the consultation could be to limit them just to exotic carbon forests, but we need your feedback about that. Any follow-up from Alex on that one? No? Okay, good. I have a question here which almost sounds like the beginnings of a submission. It sounds like it's got some of the sorts of information in it that we're looking to elicit. So the question is, how would we deal with the policy conflict of not wanting forests on highly erodible red zoned land? So that's land use classes 6E, 7E and 8E. Wouldn't we need to enable and not constrain afforestation on class 4 and 5 land? And the questioner notes there's not that much class 5 land in New Zealand. Is another option to develop national direction to constrain consenting to land use classes lower down that are suitable for arable uses, such as land use classes 1 and 2 or 1, 2 and 3.
Okay. So yes, that's totally an option. That's why we haven't gone out with a particular consenting regime that relates to a group of land use classes, and that's the sort of feedback that we need. So yeah, we can totally look at just the lower land use classes where there's particular issues. And you're right that particularly on the high land use classes and the most erodible land, often forests are a good land use. Now, you know, working through and to go a little bit deeper to hopefully help inform anyone that's submitting on this, picking a land use class or group of classes as a basis for a consent threshold is always going to be tricky because they don't necessarily line up with property boundaries or forest boundaries or where people want a forest. And the challenges of trying to have a system that works and manages the concerns that we're hearing from communities is the one that is always going to be a real challenge. And there's always going to be marginal cases, you know, like you mentioned, class 5 land, you know, there's not a lot of it, and how we deal with it either way would be challenging in a consent system. Hopefully that's enough.
Thanks, thanks, Alex. And one last question, which is, again, it's an option that's not in the consultation document. So the question is, what about a national policy statement to allow local flexibility, but to provide strong national direction, which would include OBS polls. So I've forgotten what OBS is for, policies and implementation that mutually support removal aspects of emission budgets and the emission reduction plan. Objectives, yes, objectives. Would Alex, would you be able to speak to the national policy statement?
So I can speak to that. So yeah, as Tracy mentioned, this is a consultation on the National Environmental Standard, and we're working with that because we've done a review recently and it's the tool we have in place. Now, we're well aware that for some of these matters, we are trying to manage things that needing objectives and policies for is that you need objectives and policies to manage well. And that's one of the thoughts behind that option 1, enabling stringency. With an NPS, you're totally right. There's the opportunity to do more or do things differently there. And so if you think that that would be helpful, feel free to tell us. But of course, remember that we are dealing with a consultation on the NESPF at the moment as well. And
thank you, Alex. One more question, which Bridget would be able to speak to. How would the proposed changes to the National Environmental Standard for plantation forestry deal with a mixed species forest, one that was a combination of exotic and native? Bridget.
Yeah, I kind of thought, what was I doing volunteering to answer this, because it's quite complex, really. And I think the straight answer is that this is something that needs to be worked out in terms of thinking through definitions. But I mean, your question is quite important when thinking about, you know, is a forest a forest, and what are the different activities that you do with the forest and why do you plant it? So I think these are things that we still need to work through, but it also comes back to those questions that were raised earlier about the different activities and what they are. And so, yeah, you want to have regulation or rules that manage effects where you've identified them and identified that they need to be managed. So I think this is work that needs to be done in thinking about, Indigenous species as well. So thanks for that question.
Thanks, Bridget. And thanks very much, Bridget and Alex, for answering those questions. We will move on now to the next part C, which Shannon's going to talk us through the options we have set out in this part. Thanks, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. If we can move on to the slide about what the issue is for part C, improving wildfire risk management. So while we know that forests play an important role in our response to climate change, unfortunately, they're also a great source of fuel for wildfires. And when we have wildfires, these are a significant loss for foresters, and they may also have damaging effects on the environment and on the wider community. So within these proposals, we are acknowledging that Fire and Emergency New Zealand are responsible for managing fire response and risk reduction across the country, and that they have service agreements with many of the larger forestry companies that incorporate response plans, resources available, and staff training levels. There are 14,000 smaller forests on farms and small properties that do not have this level of resource or knowledge. And Fire and Emergency New Zealand cannot easily identify or engage with the owners or managers of all these smaller forests. Councils can also play a role in managing wildfire risk under Section 6H of the Resource Management Act, which is management of significant risks from natural hazards, but these approaches vary widely. And we're looking at this because there are more forests in the landscape and the risk of wildfires is increasing due to climate change. Since 2000, the number of wildfires climbed steadily to a peak in the 2019-20 season. And in the last 5 years, the main risk to plantation forests has been fires started on neighbouring land. Scion predicts the wildfire risk will increase as a result of climate change. Most areas of the country are likely to see more very high and extreme fire weather danger days. And we think it's really important to raise awareness of wildfire risk across the rural landscape. When wildfires do occur, they can have a wide range of adverse environmental and other effects. As well as the loss of the timber crop and carbon credits, wildfires cause damage to infrastructure and have a range of social and economic costs. Adverse environmental effects pose a risk to outcomes relating to carbon sequestration, air quality, water quality, and sedimentation. Let's go to the next slide. So the proposals to manage the wildfire risk, in order to raise awareness of risk and risk reduction practices, we're seeking feedback on a proposal to require all forests covered by the NESPF, which is forests larger than 1 hectare, to prepare a wildfire risk management plan, to attest to its completeness when notifying councils of the planned afforestation or as part of the consent process, and to make a copy of the plan available to the council if requested, either so the council can verify the conditions of a permitted activity have been met, or maybe as a matter of discretion where a resource consent is required for afforestation. If exotic carbon forests are brought within the scope of the NESPF, as outlined earlier, the new requirement would apply to both plantation and exotic carbon forests. This proposal is about foresters planning to manage the risk of wildfires, not the firefighting response during a wildfire, and Fire and Emergency is still the lead agency for fire risk management and response. Our aim is to reduce the environmental impacts of wildfire by ensuring all foresters, both large and small, consider the risk of wildfire, put in place measures to mitigate the risk, and share their information. Requiring all foresters to have a wildfire risk management plan would ensure that the risk of wildfire is considered when planning the forest and managing it over its life cycle, and in a way that's proportionate to the risk. Requirements for the content of the plan could vary according to the size of the forest, with a simpler plan envisaged for small blocks and a more comprehensive plan for the larger forests. Most large forest companies already have this type of information within their forest management plan and through operational service agreements with Fire and Emergency New Zealand. In most cases, this would not change their wildfire planning. Fire and Emergency New Zealand and Te Ure Rako will work with the forestry sector to develop templates and guidance material for foresters. And for farmers, this could be developed as a module that is consistent with integrated farm plan templates. If the proposal outlined earlier to require forest management plans for exotic carbon forests is adopted, we would develop the requirements for wildfire risk management content to align with the templates for those plans. And yeah, we really are welcoming feedback on this proposal as well. And we're particularly interested in the comments on the role of councils. If they are receiving plans, how frequently plans should be reviewed, whether developing a module for farmers that's consistent with farm plan templates would be useful, and what implementation support would be needed. Next slide, please. When we're considering the impacts, we anticipate that small and large foresters would be the main groups affected by this proposal. We expect that the impacts will be different depending on the size of the forest, and we principally want to raise awareness rather than put in new regulatory requirements. For large-scale foresters will be subject to the new requirement to have a wildfire risk management plan, but most will already have this required information as part of their forest management plan, including through operational service agreements with Fire and Emergency New Zealand. Where there is already a plan in place which covers the required matters, there would be no requirement to develop a new plan. The impact on smaller foresters is expected to vary depending on the level of planning already in place. We expect that many or most will need to formalise a fire risk management plan. However, the proposal is that the required content will be less comprehensive than for larger forests and proportionate to the level of risk. As we've mentioned, for farmers with woodlots, we are seeking feedback on whether templates should be aligned with farm plans. The impact on councils will depend on whether they actively use the fire plans, and we are seeking feedback on this. We're not proposing that councils are responsible for ensuring foresters have prepared a suitable wildfire risk management plan. The condition of a permitted activity is that they have prepared a plan that complies with the standards. For rural communities and the wider public, we expect there'd be benefits from increased awareness of wildfire and improved planning at afforestation and over the life of the forests to reduce the risks. And yeah, we do welcome feedback on whether we have accurately understood the likely impact of these proposals. And it's through to questions, Tracy.
Thanks, Shannon. Thank you. I'm going to call on Bridget again to help us with answering most of these questions. Bridget, in the interest of time,
I'll
would you like to work through them? Yeah.
Yeah, I will, thanks. And here's an advertisement for a workshop on C&D, which is on Monday, the 7th of November. So, we'll have I hope Fiona Hennessy, our Te Rako fire coordinator, along for that discussion as well for fire. So people are asking a couple of questions about whether, so first off, it's pointed out that a lot of fires that affect the rural sector come from both the rural-urban boundary, is a really big risk, or they come from outside plantation forests and in fact affect the plantation forests. And you know, I'm well aware that the Pigeon Valley fire in Nelson in 2019 was caused, you know, it spread from a farm and ended up causing significant damage to plantation forest there. No question that those are issues that need to be managed. In thinking about what we needed to do with fire, which is a concern for a lot of people, the question is there a place for an RMA solution here? FENS manage fire, it's in their legislation, but people are concerned, particularly in relation to permanent exotic forests, what will happen? Are people just going to plant these forests and leave and not monitor them, and they're going to become a fire risk? So we're trying to answer those questions about how we manage the risk. Fire is a natural hazard, and so there is potentially a way through that for councils to be involved in that and to deal with it in some way through a national direction instrument. We also know that councils do not have large capacity in this area. Some councils will still have some involvement in fires, others will not. So I guess we are really asking the question of, is this something that is a useful thing that in particular will pull in the smaller foresters who don't have response, who don't have the powers for planning that perhaps the larger companies do have, and we certainly recognise that they have them. And could this be helpful? Someone's also asked about gorse and manuka, saying, you know, which are used extensively as nurse crops for native planting and regeneration, which is far more flammable. Yes, I too have seen the list that places pine at about number 40 and manuka very, very low on the list. It is the idea that indigenous species are not flammable is not proved by the evidence. However, of course, you know, our dominant species of pine and is you know, trees will burn. So you make a very good point, and I think that's one of the things that needs to be addressed in considering what happens with native forests in future. In terms of what the role of FENS is, I'm hoping that FENS can bring someone to the workshop next week. FENS tell us one of the issues that they have is just the reach that they need to be able to get to smaller growers. They have agreements with the larger growers. You know, it's possible that actually they can get the information that they want about accessibility and things through notifications through the NESPF. At the moment, yes, we have people who are within the ETS system who are growing, potentially would be growing permanent forests, but that is something we can't release the information about participants. So we're thinking around this area quite a bit. The key thing is we want FENS to be able to have access to forests if they burn, to know who to contact, and we want people who have forests to be able to protect those. This might be one way of doing it. There might be others. We are quite open-minded on this. Thanks. I think that's enough I think that's answered most of those questions, hopefully. But yeah, come next week and grill me some more.
Thank you. Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, the workshop with Fiona and someone from FENS, hopefully there will be an opportunity to drill down a bit more into this. So with that, we'll move on to part D, and Shannon's going to run us through the proposals under part D. Just in brief, they're mostly quite technical changes to a number of areas in the existing regulation. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you, and ngā mihi to all our attendees. This is the last of the 4 parts, so we'll get cracking into it. So the opportunity, the NESPF came into effect in 2018 on the 1st of May. And in 2019, Te Urarako, the New Zealand Forest Service and the Ministry for the Environment carried out a review to see how those regulations were working and to consider some specific matters such as slash management and wild and conifer control. The review found that overall the NESPF is an effective framework for maintaining or improving environmental outcomes associated with plantation forestry activities, although it found that changes in some areas could improve the outcomes. One of the findings was that some councils are lacking capacity and experience in plantation forestry, and that these skills are not easily gained or available. In addition, since the regulations have come into force, a range of users have brought a number of operational and technical matters to our attention. So this consultation is also providing us with an opportunity to address and improve these issues. Next slide, please. So we're looking for feedback on proposed amendments to update and improve the effectiveness of the NESPF to ensure that it is fit for purpose. We are interested in hearing what type of information or training would help councils and foresters better implement and comply with the NESPF regulations. If the proposals discussed earlier to extend the scope of the NESPF are adopted, the proposals in this part of the consultation document would also apply to exotic carbon forestry where relevant. The The proposed amendments are detailed and technical, so as Tracy said, we're just going to go through them lightly today. The key proposals are, in relation to managing wilding conifer risk, we propose updating the wilding tree risk calculator and guidance to reflect the latest science, extending the notification period to give councils and foresters more time to address any issues before foresters have committed resources, and requiring that all forests are reassessed for wilding risk at replanting. The slash management proposals are minor amendments which aim to improve clarity and direction for foresters and council compliance staff. The review found that the regulations themselves were largely fit for purpose, but that changes in practice and awareness were important in some parts of the country. Initial proposals to align the NESPF with the NES freshwater, which came into force in 2020, are straightforward changes to ensure freshwater rules apply equally where circumstances are very similar. These changes are relating to fish passage, the definition of sediment control measures, and vehicle machinery in and around wetlands. Further alignment still needs to be considered in other areas, and we expect that this is going to be done through the proposed national planning framework when that new resource management legislation is in place. The operational and technical proposals respond to matters raised by a range of users and relate to river crossings, treaty settlement areas within outstanding natural water bodies, notice periods, traffic management, Indigenous vegetation and significant natural areas, erosion susceptibility classification, sediment management, health and safety, and clarifying that local authorities must not charge for receiving notifications. As with all the other parts, we really do welcome feedback on the proposed amendments, and really we are interested in hearing particularly from councils on their information and training needs. If we can go to the next slide, please. So with respect to impacts for councils and foresters will be directly impacted by the proposals, and we expect the impacts to be minor and generally positive because we're aiming to improve and update the regulations to ensure that they are fit for purpose. The feedback that we do receive on information and training needs will help us to improve central government support for councils and foresters. Rural communities and the wider public will benefit indirectly from a more effective and efficient regulatory framework for managing the environmental effects of forestry. And yeah, feedback on whether we've accurately understood the likely impact of these proposals is welcome and invited, please. That's part D. Back to you, Tracy. Oh, mute.
Unmuting. I'm unmuting. Sorry, it was bound to happen. One of us was bound to do it. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Shannon, for popping through those proposals briefly. As Bridget mentioned, we'll be covering them in more detail in the workshop next Monday on parts C and D. We've got a couple of questions here, and I'm again going to call on Bridget to help answer these. The first one is about how we've come to choose the findings from the year one review that we are looking at making changes on. So the question is asking why are some of the major issues that were identified not being dealt with? For example, the reliability of the erosion susceptibility classification and a formal requirement for a structured risk assessment. Can you help with that, Bridget?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I would question whether that's the case. I think we are dealing with not all of the issues, because there are a number of matters that were raised, and we don't have the capacity at the moment to deal with everything. I guess the reliability of the ESC, the ESC, the erosion susceptibility classification, is a drafting gate for resource consent. It has never been intended to manage everything, all risks under the NESPF, and the NESPF has regulations in every part of it which require foresters to manage the issues that the ESC lines up, which is erosion and sedimentation. So I don't think that a significant change to the ESC is going to change what's required, which is you must manage the risks of erosion and you must manage your sediment where it occurs. Having said that, we're well aware that the ESC is it's a national tool. It's based on information which is at least 1 to 50,000 scale, which is not appropriate for managing farm scale activities or forest scale activities, and that's why foresters are required to have management plans that are mapped at a farm scale of 1 to 10,000. So there are some difficulties around it, but we've built a system that manages those. Having said that, we are doing some work at the moment looking at some of the other tools that can be used to increase certainty, and I know a lot of forestry companies use those tools such as LiDAR and smaller scale measurements regularly. That's harder for smaller foresters to access, but there are some, national scale LiDAR is being, being mapped. Won't cover the whole country yet, but it is being marked. I'm not sure what you mean by a formal requirement for a structured risk assessment, but certainly bring that up in your submission, and we'll have a look at that, or I'm happy to have a chat about that separately.
Thanks, Bridget. There's a couple of questions here relating to funding and capability for councils, I think. One of the questions relates to if there are additional monitoring requirements for afforestation or carbon forestry activities, will Regulation 106 for chargeable time be reviewed? And related, I think, is there any scope for additional levies on foresters to help fund monitoring, compliance and enforcement activities?
I can take the carbon forestry and related to 106 one.
Thanks, Alex.
So the short answer here is it depends. So if we go with giving councils control through stringency, and councils set resource consent requirements, that would go through your regular resource consent charging, not necessarily through the NES PF permitted monitoring charging. If we go with a national consent system, that's the sort of feedback that we'd like to hear based on the structure. So for instance, if you want something to be permitted, but there does need to be some monitoring associated with that, and to have that work, we need to have Regulation 106 work for afforestation. Let us know, because the whole design of that consenting system and associated permitted activities is up for discussion with that second option. I hope that's nice and clear.
Thanks, Alex. Bridget, did you have anything that you could add on the second question about is there any scope for additional levies?
Well, I'll just, there's another question further down on capacity. Someone's asked, is there any scope for additional levies on foresters to help fund monitoring, compliance, enforcement activities? And I guess, this is the question of what it is that you need to monitor and what the risks are. And one of the things that we have found and found in our one-year review is that we've seen some councils that formerly did nothing in the way of compliance and enforcement of forests that they managed through their own plan rules, and we've put in place some regulations that enabled people to charge, and we've seen some cases where no sort of risk assessment is done, but people are turning up and charging and going away again, or in some cases putting private compliance and enforcement people in charge, who are then going and checking out what's happening. We're really, really concerned that compliance and enforcement is risk-based, that people are looking at what it is that needs to be monitored, going and monitoring that when it needs to be monitored, and when a forest is growing and is not causing issues, what is it that you want to monitor? So I understand where councils come from, because, you have 1,000,001 jobs, and, you either have to find your funding through the rating base or through charges. But, this is a really important thing. Is what is the risk that we are managing? And there are some risks, and we want to see those risks managed, but I think we need more discussion around this. We are doing some work in this area, and hope to be able to provide some more guidance and information in there. I'll see a couple of questions here. So someone's asked, what's the impact of the Forest Advisors Bill on council compliance staff being able to undertake compliance work around the changes? And I am not an expert in this area. I do not know well, but can find out for you. But my understanding is that council forest, if you're a forest advisor in a council, you will have to comply with the as a forest advisor and become certified. And I know that there are quite a lot of conversations around this. So good question. And I'm sorry, I can't answer it very well. And finally, this question about the review of the wilding conifer calculator, will it include further guidance about how councils can challenge a wilding score undertaken by a qualified person? Could there be an approval process? We have discussed that. I will hope to see you at the workshop next Monday, and my colleague Carl Jaeger will be able to answer that better than I can. But the plan at the moment is to update the wilding conifer calculator. There is a technical advisory group that's been advising us, and we're looking to let a contract to get that done, hopefully before the end of the year, and that would certainly come with guidance, because we recognise that this is something that it's hard to be an expert on these things without having years of experience, and so we need to work through how that can work.
Thanks, Bridget.
Everything.
There's one other question here about if. So will there be consequential changes to the ETS to provide that foresters do not replant areas identified as a wilding risk if the NESPF introduces the replant assessment requirement?
It's a really good question, and actually I've not seen it in this context of wilding risk, but it's certainly been a question that's asked in relation to biodiversity, where if there is some limit on what people can harvest for biodiversity purposes. The answer is I don't know, but in terms of natural justice, it would seem to be something that needs to be looked at.
Just to add to that, because I did a very brief look at this when we were working through this proposal too, it's likely to be a little bit more complex than the wilding risk preventing replant. For instance, if you have a situation where your existing species is one of high risk, I'm going to say contorta, even though I highly doubt anyone has a contorta species, and then at replant you do the assessment and discover that you can comply with the wilding risk calculator by planting something of lower risk, for example, radiata, then replant there doesn't mean you've completely had to deforest that land in terms of the ETS. So we'll need to work through that and just be careful in terms of exactly what it means. Like Bridget, more than happy to work through, and if you have specific examples on that would help us work through that, please pass them through.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. I'm just looking at the time, and it is nearly 2:30. So I think it would be great if we can wrap up now. So could I have the next slide, please? So just a reminder that submissions close on the 18th of November. We really, as we've been saying throughout the webinar, we're really keen for your feedback so that we can feed your views through to ministers. The project team will be analysing submissions and reporting on feedback as is normal. Eventually there will be a summary of submissions published also. Ministers will be making decisions about what they want to present to their cabinet colleagues. They would like to be making decisions in the early part of 2023, but that will depend whether and what options ministers would like to move ahead with for Part B. So as Alex outlined, option 2 under Part B is we have the idea of a consenting framework, but we need your feedback to be able to develop the content for one, if that is where ministers would like to go. So that might shift the timeline out a bit. And we will, any questions that we didn't manage to get to today, we're going to collect those up and respond to you in due course. I'm sorry if we didn't manage to get to your question. Next slide, please. As we've been saying, there are some technical workshops coming up, some more webinars, so please do attend for more of a detailed discussion about the issues and options. And lastly, I'd just like to thank you very much for participating today. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on our website in due course. Thanks also to the presenters and people who answered questions, much appreciated. That's it, everybody. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Ngā mihi ki a koutou katoa. Thank you.